What I'd like to first of all say is that this talk is on behalf of the SDC. It's the SDC program managed by UNDP on strengthening state strategies for climate action. The program took place in the last couple of years. It was a multi-sectoral program, and what I want to talk today about, or present today, is actually about the landslide component that was done in Uttarakhand. Now, the goals of the pilot project, and I want to stress the fact that this is a pilot project, was to look at a rainfall threshold landslide early warning system for a particular part of a road section. And in that program, we were able to review different landslide maps and undertake visits to the situation in the field to understand the situation analysis, actually. The idea was also to install an early warning system, some sort of pilot system based on automatic weather stations, design and develop the early warning threshold system, the model for the early warning, but also equip district disaster management centres in terms of their capacity, and part of that was to also upgrade to a state-of-the-art. So here we are in Uttarakhand. The initial field site stretched from Uttarakhand to Gangotri. We visited a number of different sites, my colleagues and I, and what we did was focus on a certain section. The reason we focused here was more that there was a landslide record which had been kept by the Border Roads organisation. And there were a concentration of landslide events in the section that you see on the slide. Now, when we look at this in the bigger picture, we want to talk about an early warning system based on rainfall threshold. What does that actually mean? We have a large area. We have a road section which is intersected by many different channels, river channels coming off the higher peaks. We have landslides on those slopes. We have cut road sections where we have very sheer rock slopes with loose rocks, basically. So we have a whole range of different phenomena, rockfall, landslide phenomena. And how are we going to build a system that takes all of those different phenomena into consideration when the rain falls, and then decide where is it going to be higher or lower danger? That's a challenge. Okay, so from the situation analysis, what we saw was four basic things. What we see are discrete landslides, which have failed. They failed in the past, where they've blocked the road or whatever, and they're candidates for reactivation. So when it rains again, more of the landslide might come again. And then we have areas where there are discrete landslides, where it hasn't really failed catastrophically, that we see evidence for movement, so it's deforming. And maybe every time it rains, it deforms a little bit more, but at some stage in the future, a catastrophic event will happen, or may happen. And then we have the channelized events. This is where we have channels intersecting the road section that are sources for flash flood and debris flows when we have cloudburst situations. And then we have, of course, rockfall, which are in the cuttings caused by the road construction. So perhaps initially when the road was constructed, the rockfall danger was lower, but over time, certain factors make the rock more prone to rockfall. And these are the four basic cases. While we were there, we actually experienced a cloudburst, and we were stuck on the road for 8 hours waiting for it to be cleared. But what was interesting about the event was it was a very localized cloudburst. We don't know where it was actually centered. Actually, we don't know if there were other landslides occurring on other sections of the road, but where we were at the time, we witnessed a flash flood coming onto the road, blocking the road, consisting of maybe a few hundred cubic metres of rock. And then you had the flood waters themselves. Now, we don't know how high the flood waters were, which is actually quite important because it gives you an idea about what type of intensity levels are relevant for people and cars and trucks travelling on this road. This is an important element of the risk. In this case, there were casualties, there were actually fatalities. There were 3 fatalities, and there were people who were in the car at the time, and they apparently got out of the car and were washed away. And this is also an important indicator about how people should act, how they should react when these events take place. Maybe these people would not have been washed away had they stayed in their car, because the car, as you can see in this picture here, is relatively safe. So here in the foreground you see the flash flood deposits, and then in distance here you see a rockfall. You see an area of rockfall which came directly from the rock wall. So there are 2 different phenomena that were triggered by the one rainfall event. So the question is, in an early warning system, how do we deal with making some kind of prediction about 2 very different events that have probably quite different triggering characteristics? And even if we could say this was dangerous here, what do we do? Do we close the road and not let traffic through? So it's the question of what to do in the emergency response when we have a prediction. Now, one of the difficulties, of course, in predicting is that there are different factors at play that cause a landslide to actually trigger, and the most simple representation of that is here. So we have properties, soil rock properties, we have rainfall, precipitation, we have infiltration of that rainfall, we have surface runoff of that rainfall, and we have vegetation. And in the case of Uttarakhand and many places in the Himalaya, those 3 are probably the key ones that are at play. They're intersecting. And so this area here of intersection changes, and it may change for a section of road, for example. So where we were in the southern part of the road section in our study area that I showed you earlier, it might be a little bit different when you go to the northern part, because maybe the lithology changes, maybe the geological structures change, the vegetation changes, the deepness of the weathering profile, and so on and so on. And what's really clear is that we have to consider that it's these effective stresses that come from this interplay that we have to worry about. And the reason why I say that is because it might be too simple just to look empirically at the problem and say, when I have a certain rainfall amount, then a landslide is going to happen. This on some very simple level happens, but we need to understand actually why it happens and what's the variability possible for a particular area that we're focusing on. So in the program, we looked at, or my colleagues looked at landslide susceptibility. They gathered pre-existing data, GIS-based data, to analyse where landslides could take place, where it's more likely that a landslide will take place and where less likely. Now, these different factors are weighted, and they're weighted against expert opinion or perhaps evidence. And depending on how you weight them, you can get different results. So when you select the most relevant parameters for this section of the study area, as my colleagues did here, they were looking at rainfall, lithology, the geological structures, slope gradient, proximity to river, and so on. They're all listed up there. But what comes out is an area here of higher susceptibility, and here also. Now, what's overlaid on that is the landslide distribution based on the Border Roads Organisation database. And when we look at this, we see that we have landslides occurring in moderate to low susceptibility. We have areas occurring in a little bit higher, and again here higher. So we're actually having landslides occurring across the whole section. And the question is there a relationship between high susceptibility as mapped using the methods used for susceptibility, landslide susceptibility, and those landslide events? And this is one thing, if you're going to use susceptibility maps, you need to look at making those clear connections. Here, I think the data was a little bit uncertain and a little bit unclear, which the upshot is that the question is, how are you going to use that for early warning, or supporting at least an early warning system? Now, when we look at rainfall, the rainfall distribution, this is yearly rainfall. We see that there's maybe a concentration here, but we also are getting landslides occurring in the lower concentrations. Now, mind you, the lowest concentration here is over 1 metre of rainfall per year, so which is actually quite high anyway. So how do we interpret this? Maybe the landslides are extremely sensitive to triggering, or maybe there are other factors at play. In the project, there was an attempt to look at rainfall thresholds based on remote sensing data. So this is the TRIM data, rainfall data from TRIM. One example here is showing 2014 and 2015. But the question is, here we're trying to reconstruct the landslide event history and how that relates to the TRIM data that we've got. And we're trying to show where we have areas of high rainfall and the occurrence of a landslide. Now, it's not really clear, or let's say, it's not really obvious that there's a really strong correlation, and we have to take this into consideration and be honest about how to use this data in making the connection between rainfall and landslides. In some cases there are landslides, in other cases there are no landslides when we have the rainfall. So what do we make of that, and how do we feed that into a landslide early warning system, or how do we build a model from that? Now, there was also an attempt to put ground-based automatic weather stations in, and up till now the project wasn't able to do a full characterization and analysis of that data because it was only put in place very late in the project. But 3 stations are actually operating, and this is on the to-do list for the future. So let's turn to this question of an operational EVS based on either remote sensing data somehow feeding in, or an AVS, an automatic weather station setup. So what we really need for this to work is really a systematic procedure, a set of protocols that deliver the real-time data. So we have deliver on one hand, but we need the processing and analysis of that data directly into a model. Now, this is not a trivial thing to consider if you want this to happen in real time. So these are the challenges actually to make this work, making that chain work. Now, there are some data sources that are available, perhaps the Indian INSAT data, which the weather services use. There are other ones from satellite that can be used as well. However, what you need to make this operational is live feeds, as they're done in real-time weather forecasting. And so this is also an intersection between the Landslide Early Warning Systems and the meteorology people, so IMD. They should be connected on this. They play a crucial role in providing the near casting, the near real-time casting. So in the project, we were able to install, as I said earlier, a couple of automatic weather stations. They've been operating and they look to be operating quite nicely. However, once again, the technology, we have technology for all of this. This is not the question. The question is how you set the technology up according to operating procedures and also procedures that maintain those systems so that they're constantly feeding data. And if they stop feeding data, what are the contingencies? What redundancies do we have? How do we overcome the lack of data at a very critical moment in time? A very important component of the project was to engage with the stakeholders on the issues of disaster risk management and community level preparedness. And this was done through stakeholder consultations and analysis of those consultations. And what we have here is a list of willing participants. So we had the SDMA in Dehradun, Uttarakhand. We had some lower village level participants as well as community representatives. Now there were several focus areas taken for the situation analysis just to put some boundary conditions on the consultations. And I think the most important one I want to talk about here is the alert and response system and the integration of SOPs, so the standard operating procedures, because this is most relevant to the Landslide Early Warning System. So I'll jump a little bit to the outcomes because that's probably what we're all really interested in. This is the outcome for the alert response system and SOP integration. So what's clear, in the study area, there's no landslide specific early warning system that can effectively provide predictions or some sort of warning for the study area that we've selected. Okay, that was pretty clear. So what we had was overall problems with communication. We had a problem with communication between different stakeholders. There were procedures in place, but sometimes those procedures weren't specific enough to look at the interactions between stakeholders. So for example, there was a problem with communication to the village level because this was only happening for officials. Okay, it wasn't going through beyond designated officials. There was also an issue when communication in an EVS SOP existed, that there was a lack of coordination because the different people who were receiving the message didn't know who was receiving the message. And this is important because it requires coordination. Everybody needs to know who's receiving this message so that you can actually get on with the task of implementing standard operating procedures. There was some question whether the actual alerts that were potentially given had enough instructions about what needed to be done. So in other words, actor-specific instructions. And this plays into the role of this coordination between the different actors. The response time and the efficiency of getting the SOPs working were perhaps lacking. Perhaps the outcome was perhaps they were a little bit slow. There were some inefficiencies that weren't making this happen in the time frames that it should have been happening. And one area which is critical for early warning, of course, was that in some communities there was no mobile coverage. So no GPRS, no GSM coverage to actually bring these messages through. And this is also a problem for the technology, for the measuring stations in the field, so that the real-time functionality exists. Okay, The other major problems that were seen were the vertical and horizontal connectivity communication between the stakeholders. And it reflects a little bit what was discussed in the plenum, in the other talks that were presented in this conference, that different agencies need to be working together. They need to be sharing data, they need to be sharing experiences, and when things are hot and things are happening, they have to be able to share and coordinate together to get to reach the goals that we want in a disaster risk management plan, early warning system plan, or whatever. So, the road forward. We have to still do a lot of work to achieve the last mile in implementing a rainfall threshold landslide early warning system in this study area. There's a lot of on-the-ground work to be done. There's a lot of technical solutions to be solved to make the systems fully operational and working 24/7, for example. We have to solve the communication problems, the technical communication problems. That has to be widespread. All stakeholders need to receive alerts as fast as possible, and this has to be tested. There has to be drills and mock drills and tests before the system goes online. All SOPs need to be updated to ensure the vertical and horizontal coordination between all stakeholders. And all of the functions and limitations of the early warning system or the strategy need to be understood by all the relevant actors. And lastly is that the landslide risk and hazard maps need to be fully elaborated. These maps are critical for land use planning and also planning any kind of intervention when a landslide happens. So that's where I'd like to leave it for the moment, and thanks for your attention.